Well, welcome everyone. I'm Joseph Davis with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation, and we're excited to have you join us here today for this conversation, a conversation about education benefits that work. Now, more specifically, we're going to talk about how employers can leverage Section 127 of the Internal Revenue Code to invest in their workforce, reduce student debt, and support lifelong learning. Now, for those of you that may not know, enacted in 1978, Section 127 allows employers to offer up to $5,250 a year in tax-free education assistance. Now, this has the potential to help a lot of people, but the problem is it's still underutilized, considering it can be used for tuition and, most recently, student loan repayment. So what do we want to talk about today? So the conversation today, we're going to break into 3 segments. First, we're going to talk about how employers are using Section 127 to upskill and reskill. Then we're going to talk about how this benefit can, in fact, reduce debt and support economic mobility. Now, third, we're going to talk about a new innovation that we have here at the U.S. Chamber Foundation, and that's skill savings accounts. And we're going to do that alongside our partner, Third Sector, who's been doing some great work as it relates to lifelong learning. So with that, I want to jump into it with our first guest. I want to bring in Martinez from Guild. First of all, Marty, thank you for being here. We appreciate you taking some time. Before we jump into Section 127 and how it impacts employers, can you tell us a little bit about the work at Guild?
Thanks for having me, Joe. Happy to be here today. Yeah, at Guild, we design and administer skilling and education programs on behalf of the largest employers in the U.S., typically offered as a benefit. And we aspire to turn these programs into strategic programs on behalf of our employers to help them build a talent development pipeline, for themselves, and then obviously to create opportunity for America's talent.
Now, let's talk a little bit about Section 127. Talk about the impact on employers. Historically, how's it been used?
Right. So Section 127, as you mentioned, is the tax code that sets the limits on how much they can offer employees in terms of education and skilling at 5250. And so that really is intended to align incentives with employers to invest in their employees. And so what we've done is we have tried to take that and build upon that and make the programs even more strategic. But that certainly sets the foundation for how these programs kind of came about. And we can talk a little bit about where they started versus where they're going, if that's helpful. So where they started was really about the way they were used initially by employers was to incentivize and really kind of benefit the high potential employees that you might have. So think about in the 1980s, a lot of times this was used by the white collar workers to go get an MBA and really encourage that person to stay at the organization longer. And part of that was just the way they were designed. And so tuition reimbursement is really the first instantiation of what took advantage of Section 127. And the way that tuition reimbursement worked was an employee could go and educate themselves outside of the organization. They would pay out of pocket and kind of go complete the course. Sometimes the policy would say they had to have a B or better or a C or better passing, and then they would get reimbursement. So you can imagine how much risk was involved in terms of, am I going to be successful or will I be stuck kind of holding the bag? And then also, who had access to this, given that the flow of funds had to be, hey, I'll front the money and then I'll get reimbursed sometimes 6 months later. And so that's the way that Section 127 kind of came about and kind of stayed that way for the first kind of 20, 30 years of its existence.
So thinking broadly, why are education benefits essential to upskilling or reskilling?
Yeah. Well, I think, so just picking up on where I was going with that, the innovation that Guild has tried to bring about was really, and to the point you were making, it's a great incentive, tax code incentive, but is really underutilized, in my opinion, in the corporate world. And so what we tried to do was say, how do you incentivize more people to take advantage of this? And obviously, what I was alluding to was the flow of funds was a big barrier. And so as those programs had been in place for 20, 30 years, the diminishing returns of sending kind of the upper echelons of your organization's people to go get an additional master's degree was just kind of diminishing returns. But there was a bunch of untapped talent on the front line and lower down in the organization, where if you changed the construct of how these programs worked, you could start to tap into that and really make a difference both in those individuals' lives, but really in your company's kind of talent. And so what we did is we created a payment system that allowed for the employees to not have to come out of pocket. And so what that really did is it democratized who had access. That was step one, was let's create more access so that the entire employee base at any given organization, from the CEO on down to the lowest frontline worker, has the same access to this. And so that just created an ability for more utilization of this. When we come in and take over what we would call a legacy tuition reimbursement program, we see usage go up 2x or more. And that is really about who has access to it now. So that was point one. Point two is, how do you guide folks and demystify what they should be getting skilled in, I think was part of your question. And so we do a lot of work with our employer partners to say, well, what are you trying to do with your workforce? What are the skills that are really going to enable your strategy for the next 5 years? And how do we communicate that out to your workforce? And the way that we do that is through what we call career pathways. And so 80% of our learners are enrolled in learning that ties back to a career pathway at their employer. So it is a way to take Joe's kind of question of what skills should I be developing, and be really pointy from the employer's perspective of, we want you to develop these sets of skills because we believe they will drive our business forward. And then the third piece is really about, how do you support folks that maybe entering higher education or skilling for the first time, maybe have not had the greatest experience with education in the past. What type of coaching and support do you put around these folks to make sure that they're successful? Obviously, if a company's investing in this and no one's being successful, nobody's completing these and getting the skills they need, they're going to stop investing in it. So we did that as well. 70% of Guild's learners are first-time college participants. Oh, okay. So it just speaks to who is actually using these programs now that we're able to tweak them. And it's really about aligning incentives between what the employer is willing to invest in and what the employees are willing to invest their time in. Now,
you kind of segued for me. You kind of teased it. You mentioned frontline workers, so I want to frame it around frontline workers, but can you talk a little bit about process? So you also mentioned some of the employer partners. Talk to us a little bit about the process of identifying skills for those workers and also identifying educational partners.
Right. So we like to take a very bespoke approach to this. We have, around 100 partners at Guild, employer partners, very large U.S. employer partners, and the whole point of these programs is to make them strategic for their given context. And so, we spend the first 6 months of any kind of path to partnership really trying to understand their strategy, understand what their workforce gaps are, and then designing a program both from the policy of who's eligible, for how much are they eligible, is it just up to the 5250 or is it beyond that, to really make sure that we're encouraging folks to enroll in the right sets of things. So it's very bespoke in the way that we design it. Then we think a lot about what learning partners are we putting in that catalog? And so actually one of the teams I lead at Guild is responsible for looking at all the public data, iPads and otherwise, about who is really successful with this specific population of learner. Working adult learners are a different persona than your typical student-first college-age student. And so there are some institutions that have really cracked the nut on that, and we go and partner with them and then obviously add our support on top of that. And all of this gets back to, how do you measure the impact of getting it right? And so what you think about what you're left with at the end of all that is a curated catalog of programs offered by the best institutions for working adult learners, vetted by both Guild and that employer partner to say, these are programs we want you to invest your skill sets in. And it really does a lot to really encourage people to participate when their employer is saying, hey, I'm vouching for this.
Now, you mentioned the perfect word, is impact. So that leads me to the next question. What does success look like? Like, what's needed for success? Is there a thing? Are there multiple things we need to be focusing on? What does success look like for Gil?
Yeah, and I think in a multi-staker ecosystem like this, it is always thinking about that from different angles. One of the litmus tests we use at Guild is what we call career mobility. So, as we've progressed over our 10 years, it was about creating access for folks. Then it was about how do we measure outcomes to make sure they're successfully completing. And now it's moving more towards, okay, so they've gotten the skills, they've gotten the education. Is it actually manifesting into different roles, more economic mobility for those individuals? And as we do these studies across our employer partners, folks that participate in a Guild program are 3.5 times more likely to have a career mobility within their employer. So that's how we measure what's working. And again, I think, not to belabor the point, but it's hard to put your finger on any one thing. I think all of the ingredients that go into how we deliver these programs, and I don't want to give too much credit to Guild here, it really is a three-way partnership between our learning partners do a ton here. Obviously, our employer partners are very engaged, and then the learners themselves are investing a lot of time and sweat equity into these journeys. But the payments, removing the financial burden from the learner, I think just is the biggest lever. And then obviously the support to make sure that they feel like they're on a journey, both with a coach provided by Guild, but also with the support of their employer.
That's great. Last question. I know we only have a couple minutes left, but I had to ask about the work you're doing with Team USA to work with folks that are on Team USA transitioning from competition, moving into the next phase. Can you talk a little bit about that work?
Yeah, thank you for asking. We sponsor the U.S. Olympic team. We're the official skilling partner, actually in consortium with some of our learning partners. And we thought it was just a great opportunity to demonstrate the power of these skilling programs. And if you think about, one of the underpinnings of Guild's ethos is that talent is evenly distributed, but opportunity is not. And so in this case, you have a bunch of obviously talented individuals that have shown grit and success and commitment and excellence, and will be ending one chapter of their career, their competitive careers, and looking for an on-ramp into another career. And so it was a great opportunity for us to be able to demonstrate how we work with individuals, find them the next career path for their journey, and connect them with some of our employer partners who are obviously looking for great talent, both athletically and in the corporate world.
Sounds like great work. Well, Marty, thanks so much for doing this and being here. Once again, I can't thank you enough for taking some time. Appreciate it. Next, we're going to bring on Rodney Davis to talk a little bit more about Section 127 and its impact on financial stability. All right, we're back. Rodney Davis with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. First of all, we just talked a little while ago, and I told you have the best last name.
Absolutely.
So I want to start there.
Thank you, cousin. Appreciate you.
Let me drop a number to show the gravity of what we're talking about when we talk about student debt. Currently, Americans owe about $1.6 trillion in student loans. So there's something we can address. But let me start with Section 127, and then we'll kind of get to that. Can you talk to us about how Section 127 was changed to kind of permit student loan repayment?
Sure, Joe, but let's go back to why this was a problem in the first place. You mentioned $1.6 trillion. That's more debt than all of the auto and home debt combined and all the credit card debt combined in the entire country. So student loan debt is an issue that is going to have to be addressed. And frankly, I'm glad you're bringing up Section 127, because when I got to Congress in 2013, I realized we could use the tax code to actually benefit the student debt crisis. I represented 4 public universities, 4 private universities, 8 community college districts. Student debt was a big deal to my constituents. So as we look ahead, you got to look back. And I was able to partner with now Governor Jared Polis of Colorado when he was in the House, my former colleague Scott Peters, Senator John Thune, who's now the leader, and then also Senator Mark Warner, to first address this issue and implement the eligibility for student loan debt to be eligible to be repaid, just like tuition reimbursement was under Section 127. The problem is we passed it in the CARES Act in the middle of a pandemic when companies weren't looking at hiring. So the 127 changes were made back in 2020 and then perfected in the One Big Beautiful Bill.
Since you mentioned it, I was going to ask that a little bit later, but can you talk about some of those changes, the recent changes in that bill?
Absolutely. Look, it was just a little over a month ago when a group of us from the chamber went in to see Senator Warner, and I reminded him I was the original House sponsor of the student debt repayment provisions that were changed in 2020 with his help. And he immediately talked about his goal to have this problem and this issue addressed in the One Big Beautiful Bill, in the tax reconciliation package. And that tax reconciliation package codified permanently the 127 changes to allow student debt to be treated just like tuition reimbursement. Unfortunately, we've got our job to do now in the private sector, and that's to make sure that employers know that this is a benefit, that they can actually have an impact on that $1.6 trillion debt crisis that's related directly to student debt. And also, they can have their employees be more loyal to working at that particular career path, in that particular career path. But the one thing that really stands out that's a positive change besides making these provisions permanent, the tax reconciliation bill that just passed, the president signed into law, actually indexes the $5,250 limit, not just for student debt repayment, but for tuition reimbursement to inflation. That's a new provision, and I got to give Senator Warner, Senator Thune, and Congressman Peters a lot of credit for that.
I want to hit on something because you mentioned it about employers and awareness. How do we make more employers aware? Like, we talked about the gravity of what this means for financial stability. How do we make more employers aware?
Well, that's why we're here today, Joe. That's, it's us talking to our members, the world's largest trade association, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, talking about how this is out there. This provision can be utilized today by every single private sector company in America. And if you want to solve problems when it comes to addressing student loan debt, you don't need the government to promise to forgive loans, which those promises were never realized. You need the private sector to come in and realize this is a great recruitment and a great retention tool. And how do I know that? Because the student loan repayment program in the U.S. House of Representatives that I used to work in existed long before Section 127 and the ability to not get taxed on the $5,250 was put in place in 2020. And I had a lot of people that worked for me in the House that stayed working for the U.S. House of Representatives because we were paying down their student debt, and they were seeing real debt relief because we were paying them an amount that was showing more than what they were owing each month.
Now, obviously, Section 127 can relieve the financial burden for millions of Americans. Can you talk a little bit more about the impact? What kind of impact have we seen so far with it?
Well, partners like SHRM and others are essential in us getting that message out. But right now, only about 35% of American companies have taken advantage of utilizing Section 127 for student loan debt repayment. Many more have already implemented programs that have allowed for years their employees to take advantage of tuition reimbursement. But it's tough. It's tough to, once you're working, to go back to school and access that tuition reimbursement program. But companies need to realize that they play a vital role in addressing a major part of why families cannot go achieve the American dream because they're saddled with student debt. I mean, and don't underestimate employees that you may have in your organization who never graduated from college. They may have gone to an institution and decided to walk away before they got that degree for a wide variety of reasons. And they still may have that student debt. And others, might have gone to some second-rate universities like Florida State and come out with some debt that they may have to
That was
address.
an unnecessary shot. Right? That was an unnecessary shot. So we know there's benefits for both employers and workers. So I want to start with the employers first. Can you speak to some specific benefits for some employers that may be watching us right now? What can they expect? What are some benefits for employers? We talked about incentives too at the top. So what are some benefits for employers?
Well, first off, you as an employer are not paying payroll taxes on the benefit that you're giving that employee. And frankly, one of the best recruitment and retention tools that I had as a member of Congress and as a staff member for a member of Congress for 16 years before that was the student debt repayment program, because I was able to use that as a recruitment tool and frankly, even better retention tool. But employers should be asking their potential recruits, would you take advantage of a program like this if it was offered? See what see for yourself what the demand would be, and then become that supply. And then what you're doing as an employer is looking at your overall budget for personnel to begin with. And if you are offering a certain percentage in student debt repayment that could be up to $5,250 a year or more, start calculating that into the overall package. And if you have a certain amount, let's say $5,000 a year that you're giving your employee that you would have given to them as salary to begin with, you're actually paying less for that employee if you give to that employee as student debt because you're not paying payroll taxes on it. That's an incentive. And that's an additional financial incentive to the recruitment and retention incentives that you should be looking at right now.
Now you mentioned, a consideration you had as an employer. Are there any considerations, thinking about putting the benefits to this side, are there any considerations that employers should be, thinking about as they hear this conversation?
Certainly. What they're going to have to do is update their tuition, update their Section 127 plan that they put in place for tuition reimbursement, in many cases decades ago. You got to update that plan for the IRS. It just says we're going to include student debt in our plan. So that's a consideration that they have to take. The considerations that I think employers need to be most concerned about is just educating themselves on the benefits of this program. I can tell you, as somebody who worked so hard to pass this legislation back in 2020, it amazed me the multiple conversations I would have with Fortune 500 companies that I represented who had no idea this benefit was even out there. So it's going to take companies at the CEO level and the C-suite level forcing their finance departments, their HR departments, to look at this as a valuable tool to bring the best and the brightest to come work for them.
That's great. Now, we talked about the two sides, the two beneficiaries. Let's talk a little bit about workers. What are some benefits for those workers when thinking about Section 127?
Well, if I was going to look for a new job, and after this webinar, I might have to.
I mean, with the Florida State shot,
Yeah.
I mean,
Absolutely.
I think so.
If I was going to a new employer and I had student loan debt, even at my age, the first thing I would ask any potential employer is if they had this program. And frankly, when you're looking here in the DC metro area where we are today, many of the young people who are coming off of working on Capitol Hill in the House and the Senate and are going into the private sector employers in and around the DC metro area, that's a question many of them ask, because they've been so used to getting their student loan repayments paid at a higher level than what their monthly payment was, and they're starting to see that principal go down substantially, which makes them want to participate in a program like this. So the workers need to take on this challenge and ask employers why they're not investing into them and the education that allowed them to be qualified to work at that particular job site.
Last word for employers, for workers that are hearing this conversation and thinking about it. What's the last thing you want to leave with them if they're considering if this makes sense?
Well, if you're an employee, again, go find out what the potential for your employer is if you have student debt. Because if you have that student debt, this should be an additional benefit that is provided to you, just like if you were to go back to school while working for that same employer, already is in most cases. For employers, don't calculate the worst case scenarios. Start to identify how many people might take advantage of this, and don't automatically calculate that you're going to pay them the max amount that you can pay them that's tax-free. Start calculating what you can do to see the success of a program initially, and then invest more if you start to see the results, the positive results in recruitment and retention. That's what I would tell employers, because too many employers want to find a way to know rather than find a way to what we've already shown in government is a success.
It's a great way to close us out. Right now, I appreciate you taking some time and joining us. It's a great conversation. We appreciate it. We're going to transition our last conversation. We're going to talk more about our new innovation, skill savings accounts, and lifelong learning. All right, we're back with Dr. Joy Coates and Peter Beard, and I want to jump in, but first, Joy, I want you to talk a little bit about third sector and the work that you do before we kind of get into the good stuff.
Well, thank you, Joe. Super happy to be here with you all today. It's been an amazing conversation. So some of the areas of focus that we have at third sector, particularly around post-secondary opportunity, include cross-sector collaboration, accelerating pathways, and financial empowerment, one of the reasons that we're here today. And when we say post-secondary opportunity, we really are thinking about what happens to that individual after high school, whether it's an adult learner, a traditional high school learner, opportunity youth, an adult learner who's already working and raising a young family, as I did when I pursued my post-secondary education, and what are all the different intersections that are available to them, not only in terms of quality credentials, but in terms of actually financing these credentials. We know a lot of folk already work, already have expenses, and we are working with states and intermediaries and local stakeholders to bring the voices of those folks into the room, first off, when we make our recommendations for what needs to change. And then we think about program design and more intentionally convening some of these collaborations between states, financial partners, employers, so on and so forth. We want to think about what is going to be the most impactful, creative, and collaborative way to go about some of these things while centering the voices and the need that we are aware of from the time that we spend on the ground with our states and partners.
Now, when we talked last week, you mentioned something, and I understood it as being something really important. Improving pathways to getting credentials. Can you talk a little bit about that, what we need to do, what's important there?
So I think there's a couple of different pieces that are really key. When we think about improving pathways, we have to understand, first off, many people don't know what even pathways are available to them. That's one of the reasons we consider community colleges to be so important, right? Because a community college is often really at the crux of not just providing education, but providing some wraparound services. And when you are addressing the basic needs of people, it's much easier to talk to them about educational goals and educational needs. So that's the first piece. And then those pathways are crooked, right, most of the time. Not because there's something inherently broken or wrong in the system, but because we are kind of taught, from the beginning of our academic careers that you go to high school, you go to college, maybe you've gotten some good advice from your career counselor, oftentimes you have not, and folk are really kind of sorting it out as they proceed through those different pathways. So improving the pathways is about education of what exists, what pathways are actually going to be leading you to a credential that is marketable and recognizable in the workforce in terms of your skills. And then if you're already in the workforce and you're coming up against time, you're coming up against how long you may have been in a type of role in an organization but not seeing the movement and the upward mobility that you need to see, what is the pathway for you in terms of moving vertically within your own organization or field that is going to be doable in terms of your time, that's going to be quantifiable, and is going to be affordable?
Got it. Now, I mentioned a little earlier the term lifelong learning.
Yes.
Can you first tell folks that may not be familiar what that means, and then talk a little bit about why it's important in this economy, lifelong learning?
Well, how much time do we have, Joe?
We got 8 minutes. We got 8 minutes, so.
Oh, no. We're going to do our best. So I love this question. So lifelong learning, certainly when we talk about it and others, we really do mean just what it sounds like, that your learning doesn't necessarily stop when you hit a terminal degree. And as we all know who are in the workforce, a lot of times, much of what you learn in the workforce. You learn from your colleagues, you learn from mentors, you learn from having to really pivot in your day-to-day work and occupation, right? And so when we consider lifelong learning, we consider credential pathways, experience, turning that experience into, something that'll be recognizable. Certainly years ago, I won't tell you how many, when I was in college, the big buzz was around credit for prior learning, right? And it was new then, so that tells you a little bit about how old I am. But when we think about credit for prior learning, if we maximize that with the identification of all these different skill pathways, so that if somebody is going through their career trajectory, the expectation is that they'll continue to learn. The expectation is that they'll continue to sharpen their expertise, and then there should be, if we're doing our work well, financial reward for that in the form of upward economic mobility. It's particularly important in this economy as we see fluctuations and constrictions in what the workforce even looks like, as we see the dawn of AI and people, thinking about how they want to use artificial intelligence as an enhancement, but not a replacement for our actual people and people's skills, which we know are irreplaceable. And so that lifelong learning really can become a little bit of a power tool across sectors for how we think about the way that people learn, the way that people accumulate and distribute their skills, and more importantly, the way that we can get our employers and our workforce to recognize that lifelong learning as an investment in and of itself in terms of what it means to the bottom line for their talent pipeline.
Now, sticking with lifelong learning,
Yes.
and this will be the perfect segue into talking with Peter in the next part of the conversation, innovation. What kind of innovations have you been seeing at the state level as it relates to lifelong learning?
Well, at the state level, what I'll say is we have worked with several partners, particularly out in Colorado, where we know that there are so many things going on. And what we're starting to see a lot more of is the breaking down of silos between higher ed partners, the states, and just transparently the way that dollars are moved around. So we've seen that in Colorado. We've seen that some with our partners in Mississippi, our partners in Tennessee and Michigan. And what we're seeing is folk more proactively bringing workforce boards to the table, more proactively working with institutes of higher ed to redesign things like a scholarship system, as we did with the Cozy folks out in Colorado. It's like, here are these large amounts of money that sometimes go unspent simply because people don't know how to access them. And then when we think about what are the intermediary organizations, for lack of a better word, who could benefit from these dollars when we're thinking about using those dollars to open up those college pathways and how they are mapped to the different industries. So we'll see folks in Colorado who say, not only are we reworking how we do our scholarships, we're thinking about now what do we spend those dollars on? What colleges, what majors, what industries in the community are we bringing to the table to help design pathways that are going to be funded specifically to bolster manufacturing, specifically to bolster participation in the financial services industry. So we are seeing folks use venues like their chambers of commerce, use venues like, the community college chancellor's office to bring together folk that normally might not have been in the room. We're seeing, and I'm encouraged by us seeing folks thinking less about lack and less about things that are being reduced and more about how we can maximize what we actually have and leverage it in new ways.
That's great. Peter, I want to bring you in. Sticking to innovation.
Okay.
I've already teased it. Let's talk a little bit about skill savings accounts.
Okay.
What's the why behind it? What's the context of why the Chamber Foundation decided to take that path?
So I'm going to start, building off of what Joy said and what Marty had said, which is this is all about kind of the skills pathways that help people find that that mobility and ability to move. But when you think about it, Lightcast has said that, there are a third of the jobs have had about 25% of their skills change over the last 3 years. And then an even larger percent of that has been 75%. Jobs have had 75% of their skills change in that same period, and 25%. So that amount of skills change in a dynamic economy is only going to accelerate. We're already beginning to see that with technology, automation, artificial intelligence. And how are we going to upskill? You know, there are 170 million people in our workforce today. How are we going to upskill at scale, even a portion of that need to be able to adapt and work alongside automation and technology? So that challenge of upskilling a significant part of the nation's workforce is the underlying motivation for why the Chamber Foundation, and through its talent finance initiative, came up with this concept of a skills savings account. You know, and a skills savings account, you know, just to give you a sense of what it is think about it as a flexible spending account or a health savings account, except to purchase skills. Very similar to what Marty was talking about, which is they partner with, obviously, companies to think about, you know, what are those pathways to do that, and then accelerate the ability for frontline and midline workers to access those benefits to do the upskilling, and that's a big part of the workforce. And we also heard from Marty, and, you know, in many respects, you know, kind of where Rodney was going is, you know, a lot of large companies offer the benefit. There's an awareness issue. But when you think about small and mid-sized businesses, it's a challenging piece to have an education assistance plan to administer. So if this innovation came into play and enacted, we could be able to, you know, increase the access of employers to use it along with the employee base that's there.
So I want to stick with financing talent. I want to give you a little scenario here. All right, so if we had 60 million workers who had $1,500 or more in skills savings accounts, that's a $100 billion skills marketplace. So what are the implications for creating a marketplace this significant?
Well, I think one, you know, Rodney was hinting at it. I mean, one of the alternatives to having kind of an account that an employer and employee can contribute to, the other alternative is student, you know, borrowing, which increases the debt load, which we want to try to avoid. But, you know, it also creates the opportunity for innovation. How are we going to get, you know, the work that Guild has been doing, the work that, you know, Third Sector has been doing to get community colleges, to get training providers to actually accelerate and think more agile about how they deliver it? And I think Guild was onto something, which is how do you find providers that actually can serve that very specific population of folks who are already in the workforce in a different way. And so I think that is part of the innovation. And when you think about kind of the benefits that exist today, whether it's on the public sector side or even the private sector side, there is not $100 billion, if we play out that scenario, that we'll be able to deploy to actually upskill and reskill that significant part of our workforce.
Okay. Now, SHRM Foundation recently launched their Center for Skills First Future. Obviously, it's an important trend for skills. What's the implication for skill savings accounts?
Well, I think, one, it kind of gets to what I think everyone has hinted at, which is people are acquiring skills not only through the credential they got in a college degree, but think about everything we brought to the table from our own experiences and the skills. And if you think about kind of the, you know, creating the fintech so you can actually pay for the skills program is one element of it. But some of the work that Chamber Foundation has been doing is how do you bring in the ed tech or the learning and employment records so that you have a digital wallet for the worker to document the skills that they've been able to bring, that then allows the employer, similar to what I think Marty was getting at, is how does that help me move up? And so the employer can actually see the credential and that this is a valuable credential that actually progresses, but it also empowers the worker, which is really the big piece of this, is they now have a way to share kind of the ability that I've acquired this skill, here it is in my digital wallet that I can then share with an employer, whether it's my current employer or some future employer.
Got it.
And so if I could just jump
Sure.
in for a second. So one thing that I want to add, and Peter, I love the way that you laid that out, one segue into, you know, our connection with the Chamber. And so when we talk about lifelong learning and lifelong learning accounts, right? So one of the flagships of our work that we started last year, 2 years ago, and the Chamber has been and continues to be a strong thought and a partner with on this idea of lifelong learning accounts, like an SSA, like a 529. What are these different vehicles, right? And so we spent a lot of time in the last 2 years working with states to understand what vehicles they had in place, what new ones they may need to do, what should be tweaked, and now we're moving into this space where we're able to, with our latest round of funding from Zabranchi Foundation, think about what are the intersections not just of the lifelong learning account, but we have 4 work streams that we're running simultaneously that are focused on the LILA vehicle itself, expanding that vehicle to include new ones, policy reform to, open the door for more innovations like the SSA and how it could potentially be connected to other pieces. But then this last piece that you said, though, Peter, that's another focus area of ours is how do we think about, as we think about these LILAs, what are we advising or what should we advise people to spend them on? So certainly doing deeper work on things like LERs, the LERs and I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought just for a second. Thinking through LERs and the credential quality. So much like we think about the lifelong learning account as a vehicle, as a thing, we can think about the LER as a thing, but we also want to think about that quality of those credentials and who we bring to the table. Certainly SHRM, the work that they have done has been fantastic. We've been able to be involved through various organizations, but it's really making sure that all these folks are kind of following each other along in this conversation, almost like if we looked at it as a bit of as a Rubik's Cube in terms of what sides all need to come together and how they need to talk to each other. And so, Peter, the thing that I would ask about the SSA and the skill connection, what do you think would be the best role for us at Third Sector when we think about convening people, as we want to do, the employers, the institutes of higher ed, and then folks like yourself who actually know how that education and fintech intersection needs to work? What should be something that we definitely want to consider as we continue to work with you and others, bringing folks to the table more cohesively?
I mean, I think part of the idea of bringing the fintech and the ed tech together is critical to increase uptake. I mean, right now it's voluntary at some level in the sense of, will a college or, other talent provider or developer provide a credential that is a way that could be, used effectively. And so it's kind of voluntary now, but if you build it in so it actually captures it and incentivizes people to do it, then we get the uptake at a quicker pace, which I think is critically important. Plus it begins to create the data so we can get to the kind of the quality assurance that you were getting at and that Marty was hinting at, which is like, how do we know that these kinds of programs will actually take someone from point A to point B to point C, so that we see the progressions. And we know that the Burning Glass Institute and others have been looking at ways of how do you find those skill adjacencies and the actual transitions that allow folks to actually make those progressions. And given this dynamic economy, how are we going to actually help people to do that using career guidance that I think, Marty was talking about, that Guild does with other folks, that community colleges do. We're going to have to tackle that in a very different way to actually support workers at scale to find those pathways. And the data that comes from the work that we capture in the credentials will help do that.
Got it. All right, Peter, last question. I'm going to throw down a gauntlet for you.
Okay.
45 seconds for the biggest question. What's it going to take for us to make skill savings?
It's going to take, in many respects, amending Section 127 in the Internal Revenue Code to do that. Partly because, as Rodney indicated, you've got to, as an employer, you have to adopt an education assistance plan. And the whole idea is, can we create an account that an employer can contribute to, an employee can contribute to, that meets the standards of 127, but doesn't require a small or mid-sized employer necessarily to create the education assistance plan to be able to do that. And that's what it's going to take. And then it's going to take, similar to what Rodney was saying, we've got to get people to adopt it and see the value of it and make the investment in our workforce in order to sustain the economic growth and, preeminence that the United States has.
That's great. Peter, Joy,
Thanks
so much. Great way to close us out.
Thanks, Joe.
Joe.
One last thing, I know, the innovation for how we finance skills development. It's an ongoing conversation. It's never been more important. And I'm really proud that at the Chamber Foundation, we're working on that and we're making it happen. I'll say to the folks watching, this is going to be a series, so we're going to have a couple more of these coming up this year. So we're going to have one on 529 college savings plans, and then we're going to have another one on skill savings accounts that goes a little bit deeper into it, and we'll have a little bit more structured and a little bit more a deeper conversation on skill savings accounts. So please stay in touch with us. You'll get an invitation from us once we get it set. But with that, thanks again. And I want to just let everybody know, go to uschamberfoundation.org, check out some of our other work. But thanks again for joining us.